What does it feel like when you are weightless?
Oh, it just feels great. The closest thing I can describe is many of you have been in a swimming pool, and maybe you go in the water and you just kind of float if you achieve balance. If anyone has ever done scuba diving or snorkeling, sometimes you use a weight belt and you can get just equally balanced underwater. So it's kind of like that. Actually, you can get the feeling here on Earth by doing a zero-G flight, and that's when you go up in an airplane and then free fall, and you get to be weightless for about 30 seconds. And you can do that down in Kennedy Space Center, and you do about 15 loops. But feeling was great. I loved it, and I didn't have any side effects, and just it was one of the best experiences of my life after the birth of my two daughters.
What did it feel like when you landed and stepped back on Earth?
Well, I was a little bit dizzy. You know, when you're weightless, your inner ear, which determines your sense of balance, gets a little bit out of whack. It's kind of like when you're on a boat, and you know, some people get seasick on a boat, and some people in space get what's called motion sickness. So that didn't happen to me, but I did feel dizzy when I came back down to Earth. It's kind of like if you spin around 5 or 6 times, you know, that dizzy feeling. And I felt that way for about 2 or 3 days. And we were kept in quarantine by doctors and watched very carefully, you know, so we didn't stumble or anything. But other than that, I felt great. And I was also 1 inch taller when I landed than I am now, because you know, your spine, the vertebrae in your spine doesn't compress because it's weightless, so you gain a little bit of height.
What is your best memory about your trip?
Oh, just being there. You know, every morning I would wake up and say, wow, this is, you know, I'm the luckiest person on Earth to be here. So just floating weightless and knowing that I was orbiting the Earth. I mean, every 90 minutes we would go all the way around the Earth. And we were traveling 5 miles every second. You know, we were going faster than a gun shot out of a bullet shot out of a gun. So that was the best part, just being there.
How long did you have to prepare?
I had to prepare for 6 months. I trained in Russia, and it was a very intense training program. I trained with some NASA astronauts and some Russian cosmonauts. A cosmonaut is the Russian word for astronaut. And they have a training grounds outside of Moscow, the capital of Russia. And for 6 months I did training. I went to classes, you know, to learn all the safety and emergency procedures, how to use my spacesuit, what to do in case of a fire or an air leak, and some of the zero-G flights. And they'd spin us around in a centrifuge so we get used to, you know, heavy acceleration or G-forces. And so I had to prepare for 6 months before we launched from Kazakhstan, which is where the Russians launched the Soyuz vehicle.
Did you like the space food?
It wasn't bad. It was sort of like backpacking food. It was either canned or dehydrated. And the canned food, like beef stew, applesauce, things like that, we would heat up in an electric food warmer, and we got the electricity from solar cells outside the space station. And we also had dehydrated foods. That's food that's dried out and you add water to, you know, like some kinds of soup in an envelope. And my favorite were NASA shrimp cocktails.
How long did you spend in space?
I spent a total of 10 days in orbit. After we blasted off from Kazakhstan, it only took us about 9 minutes to get into orbit. But the space station is roughly 220 miles above the Earth, but you can't just crash into it. We had to make 34 orbits before we could dock at the station. So we orbited the Earth for about 2 days in our Soyuz vehicle, and then we docked on the station, and then I spent 8 days on space station. Coming down was quicker. That only took a little over 3 hours.
What was it like sleeping in space?
Sleeping was wonderful. You know, and people ask me, how do you sleep? And The answer is any way you want. You can be vertical, you can be horizontal, sideways, it doesn't matter because you're weightless, everything's floating around. The important thing is that you use a sleeping bag and that you tie the sleeping bag up, because if the sleeping bag isn't tied, you'll just float around and maybe hit your head while you're sleeping. But it was very restful sleep, and I just remember it was, I'd have great dreams, and it felt like I was literally floating in space, which I was.
I don't think anybody would want to hit their head when they were sleeping. Have you always wanted to go in space, and would you do it again someday?
Oh, the answer to both questions is a very definite yes. I'm now 63 years old, so I'm old enough to remember the beginning of the space age, when the Russians launched the Sputnik satellite. That was in October of 1957. And I was in 7th grade, and I remember, that's when Russia was called the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union and the United States were kind of like sort of enemies. We called it the Cold War. It wasn't a real war, but we didn't trust each other. So since the Russians launched the first satellite, we were very afraid that they were going to get ahead of us scientifically. So our teachers all told us we had to do more math, more science in order to catch up to the Russians. And actually, the Russians did us one of the biggest favors in the world. They kind of gave us a kick in the butt by launching Sputnik. And then when Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth in April of 1961, that was a real push for us. And then that's what got our whole Apollo program going and eventually landing on the moon. So yeah, I always wanted to go into space. And it was a lesson to me that never give up on your dreams, because when I was young, I didn't think I'd ever get into space, and I finally did when I was 60 years old. And I would love to go back a second time.
How did it feel when you blasted off?
I was very happy because, when I felt that rocket start to vibrate, I knew, yes, I was going to achieve my dream and go into space. Soyuz is very smooth going up, but of course we gain speed, and that's called acceleration. And whenever you accelerate, there's a force on your body, and it's measured in how many times the force of gravity you experience, or G-forces. And we experienced on a launch over 3.5 times gravity, or 3.5 Gs. And here's how you can estimate what that is. Imagine someone 3.5 times your own weight sitting on you. That's what 3.5 Gs is like. So it was hard to lift your arm. But other than the push back in your seat, just like when you take off in a plane or you accelerate in a car, it's similar to that feeling. I'll add one thing. I've lived in Montgomery Township for over 20 years. I live on Cherry Brook Drive, and I'm a local boy. So if I can do it, you guys can too.